Hello, extempers, speech and debaters, and everyone else listening to this podcast. I didn't mess up this time. Yeah. Welcome to another episode of the Half Hour. I know we've been kind of MIA recently, but we're back. And the question that we're asking today is, what is going on in the House of Commons? But instead of the House of Commons, we're going to be talking about the House of Representatives and the whole thing with McCarthy needing so many votes in order to earn the speakership and the whole mess with that. Now, I know, we're a little bit behind schedule because that was like almost a month ago, but bear with us. We still think it is important to cover, especially as the 118th Congress is getting rolling and representatives are getting together to dictate what's going to go on in their respective caucuses. We should talk about it. And especially as districts is coming up for the state of Wyoming, or at least for us. Sorry, districts in March for the rest of Wyoming and not Cheyenne. And also state coming up, we think it's probably important to kind of dissect this issue. So today, let's talk about it. Right, Spencer?
Right, YuYu, let's go ahead and talk about it. Yeah, we're just a titch bit behind. As a matter of fact, we're somewhat re-recording this. In reality, we're totally re-recording this. YuYu's microphone didn't pick up crap
Okay, that's not my
last
fault.
time. Okay,
That's not my fault.
it is your fault. We're gonna blame it on YuYu here. But yeah, YuYu's audio didn't come through in the recording for some reason, and we don't know if it was YuYu. We don't know if it was my recording setup. We don't know what the H it was. This is a family-friendly podcast, no H words. But we're gonna be here re-recording this episode, and then we got a juicy one that we're recording tomorrow, but that's gonna be for you next week. Make sense? Cool. Me too. What else did we have here? Oh yeah, we're somewhat credible now because I guess I have a degree, so we know how to talk politics officially. So cool. If you're not familiar with this podcast, let me break it down real quick for you. First, we start with this introduction that's way drawn out. Hey, and then we do some housekeeping. We provide you with a little bit of background information, some possible questions that may be asked, and then the show will end. If you are an extemper, a speech and debater, this show is more geared towards providing you background information, and that possible question is there for us to give possible answers to it. If you're just a general audience listener, which is possible, hey, the purpose of the show is to give you context and information, and then our spicy hot takes with the possible question at the end. So, that's a lot. YuYu, do you have anything else to add before we jump into this?
Honestly, huge congratulations to Spencer for graduating. Big milestones, making it out here in the world, gonna do big things. Am I? Yeah.
There's a possibility that might not happen.
Oh well. Wait, you're free from college. While you're free, I am halfway towards my degree. I've finally declared, so it's race relations. I'll be on top of it. But yeah, I think that's about it. There's not much else other than we do have episodes coming out. We're going to try to stay consistent. We promise. Just bear with us.
Yeah, we've been slow because me and YuYu can't coordinate anything together. Okay, being dead honest, both of us don't know how to coordinate anything, and then when we do coordinate, one of us turns around and is like, I'm just not feeling it, bro.
Honestly, scheduling is hard. Mental health first. You know the gist.
Yes. All right. If we're ready to go, we can jump in. And let's just start with Kevin McCarthy, I guess, because that's what we're talking about. And quite literally, what was one of the craziest Speaker of the House votes, Kevin McCarthy was elected after 15 rounds of voting and 4 days of stalemates. The battle for McCarthy to win his bid for Speaker of House is labeled as the United States' worst congressional dysfunction in nearly 160 years. Speaker McCarthy won with only 216 votes. Now, if I recall correctly, in 2020, the same thing kind of happened with Nancy Pelosi, but it wasn't really delayed by multiple rounds of votings and days of stalemates. Instead, she only won with 216 votes. It normally takes 218 votes to win the House Speaker here in the U.S. However, there were 6 Republicans who still did not vote for McCarthy, but the difference is they did not vote for another representative, which allowed McCarthy to easily become the House Speaker. Now, there are some questions that have risen because of McCarthy's House leadership, and specifically more around the congressional dysfunction. First, the United States needs to raise its debt ceiling again in the coming months. For more information on this, you can revisit our 7th episode of the Half Hour. But the short and sweet of this now, however, is that the narrow majority win by Republicans from the November elections and McCarthy's inability to win Speaker on the first vote indicates that the U.S. may further itself into political gridlock. Now, that's a problem. Because if we have more political gridlock, that means it's going to be more difficult to determine how to raise the debt ceiling and could possibly stop Congress from doing things. Now, that's just the way it is in the U.S., and if you're familiar with U.S. politics, we've been in political gridlock for ever. But raising the debt ceiling has been a kind of a challenge for some time. We know that it's been really provoked mainly by 2011, but it's just gotten worse over time. And as political gridlock's gotten worse since the first dates of raising the debt ceiling being a problem in 2011, now it's become into a situation where you can almost see the prerequisites and the buildup of it happening now. So, kind of something to keep in mind. If you think it's happened kind of before 2011, you can provide good evidence with that. But most historians note that 2011 is kind of the beginning of the problem with the debt ceiling and political gridlock itself. Second, the concessions that McCarthy made to earn his speakership do raise some important questions about the power that some Republicans have in the House. In order to earn the House Speaker, Kevin McCarthy did have to make deals with what some would say are the most extreme Republicans in the House of Representatives. This means that far-right Republicans could have more sway in legislation in the future. But YuYu will cover this more in her section. Lastly, there's some deep uncertainty about how long McCarthy will remain Speaker for. Evidence does show that previous Republican speakers will likely not return as Speaker of the House. John Boehner and Paul Ryan both had these troubles. The troubles were the same as what McCarthy is likely to face. The more hardcore Republicans are difficult to come to an agreement with. And considering that there is polarization, this problem will likely be worse than what Boehner and Ryan saw. And I would almost argue that it wasn't as evident with John Boehner and Paul Ryan as it will be with Kevin McCarthy. In a lot of ways, what you saw with Boehner and Ryan kind of was revealed after their speakerships, but now we've seen kind of where the Republican Party is and some of the more extreme people in the Republican Party and their stances on Kevin McCarthy himself, which is going to lead us to this situation in which it's pretty evident that the polarization is going to be seen throughout McCarthy's speakership. And I almost can guarantee that it's possible that he does not serve the full 2-year term. He's going to have a ton of trouble as House Speaker. For the Republican majority in the House of Representatives, Speaker McCarthy surely has a difficult road ahead. And YuYu, we've seen this a couple times with the Republicans. I kind of question if this has happened with the Democratic Party too, and that's being fair, right? Each party has started to split in between divisions and some bits of factions of what you could probably say. But it's really evident here with the Republican Party and delaying McCarthy's ability to become delaying the votes needed for Kevin McCarthy to become Speaker of the House. So with this long delay, it's going to question first off his leadership and how effective he is at leading the Speaker of the House, leading the House of Representatives. But mainly, like, it's going to show that sway from these most extreme Republicans, which is not particularly good in the United States.
Yeah, and honestly, I think that's like a perfect segue into this next section. Like, there's already a lot of talk and discussion about whether McCarthy does hold his leadership position and how much power he actually does have as Speaker of the House. A lot of people have been starting to compare him to Liz Truss, which we have done an episode on, and how short her term was as Prime Minister. And a lot of people that McCarthy is just not going to have the power or the leadership necessary to kind of lead the GOP in the 118th Congress. And that poses a lot of questions for kind of what does that then mean for the Republican Party? Like, what is it that they're trying to do? What can they do? And especially, like, what is McCarthy going to do? Right. So, either way, took him 15 votes to did it, but he eventually did it. And honestly, props to him for just like sticking it out through the whole thing. However, like, it is good to mention, and a little bit of history here, that this isn't the first time that we've had like such a stall in, you know, choosing Speaker of the House in American history, especially if we go way back. So the record of how many votes it took to elect the Speaker of the House is actually 133 votes. So this was during an era where they were discussing abolition and slavery, and as a result, Congress couldn't necessarily agree on what they wanted to do, and it took 133 votes to decide like who was going to be the Speaker of the House and how they're going to dictate these issues that they're going to discuss. So, if you recall in AP history, this is the moment where there was like the caning of Charles Sumner. Like, that is the defining moment of American history where there was like 133 votes and we can't even agree on simple issues. So the reason why this kind of connects to McCarthy is because how many votes it took to kind of elect him as speaker shows a little bit about how much there is sway and disagreement within the Republican Party, and kind of like draws back to that kind of history where these are issues that some people just can't agree on and can't really kind of negotiate over, right? Especially when you compare it to the Democratic Party in the vote during McCarthy's vote, where all of them kind of like simultaneously or unanimously agreed that they were going to vote for Hakeem Jeffries as speaker. And then previously, where they were consistently choosing like Nancy Pelosi. Sure, there were disagreements, like there definitely were disagreements about choosing Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House, but instead of like having to go through so many votes at a time, they only had to go through like a couple, and then people just chose to pick president instead of like voting for a Speaker of the House. And so let's get into some of the noteworthy moments and importance that this kind of vote gives to our politics today and what that means going forward. But honestly, I want to keep this segment. I know we recorded it in the first half, but I still think it's funny to kind of just point out the chaos that was going on in these votes. So, for example, I'm sure all of you have known these, but these are just some of my favorite moments. So, for example, there's like a representative hiding in the coat closet after like the first 5 votes, like losing their minds, staying in Congress like so late at night, trying to decide like when to have these votes, if they're going to have another vote, and then pushing back the votes. Then you have Representative Rogers attacking Matt Gaetz and having to be like restrained so that chaos wouldn't ensue afterwards. And you have, of course, like every single moment, every single vote, all 14 of them leading up to the vote that finally decided McCarthy as Speaker of the House. And then you have noteworthy moments like Representative Gaetz choosing Trump as someone who could be Speaker of the House. And there's like this famous video that's out there where he says, like, Donald J. Trump. And Marjorie Taylor Greene, actually, who was sitting next to him, was like laughing, kind of being like, what are you doing? After Matt Gaetz had like elected Trump as Speaker of the House. So that was all kind of funny. But to round it all out on a positive note, Hakeem Jeffries, he also gave a speech at the end of it all. It's this famous alphabet speech, kind of listing all of the accomplishments that the Democratic Party had before the midterms came around and they had to switch over to the 118th Congress. It's actually pretty cool. He like does something for each letter of the alphabet, and I would advise you to kind of check out that speech on YouTube. Okay, but enough of that. Cool highlights. What does this necessarily mean for politics today? Well, as we know, as Spencer said, McCarthy did concede a lot of things in order to get the votes that he needed. But let's talk about kind of what he conceded and then how he wants to go about like running Congress and what he's going to do as Speaker. So one of the things that he had to concede was by proxy voting, which is just the ability to vote remotely. So in Congress, especially during COVID, a lot of members chose to vote remotely, like online, because they couldn't get to the House or they were busy doing things in the district. And there was just a lot of things that came up that like hindered their ability to be there in person. But it was okay when they were casting votes on bills and stuff or on rules because they had the ability to vote remotely. But getting rid of by proxy voting could actually kind of hurt the Republican Party in some ways, mainly that there is this concern that because there is a split among the Republican Party and because the Republicans have a slim majority in the House of Representatives, it might be harder for all of them to be there to collectively like vote on issues that Democrats might not agree with and will like reject. And as a result, they don't get their majority and they don't get that bill passed and moving on to the next stage or whatnot. Other than that, there has been some considerations or like some talk about the increase in spending, and he had to concede to the Freedom Party, Freedom Caucus, or something like that. I think it's the Freedom Caucus. Defense spending, and he had to concede some of that spending just so that they would allow him to be Speaker of the House. And as Spencer's mentioned, like because talks of raising the debt ceiling is coming up, negotiating like the defense spending budget is coming up. All of that is kind of worrisome because of the fact that he had to reduce how much Congress can spend and negotiate what they're going to use like that money for in the upcoming years. Another thing that he had to concede was the number of seats on the Rules Committee for the representatives. So now I think he has to have 3 seats be reserved for members of the Freedom Caucus be on the Rules Committee. And that's a significant step because the Rules Committee does a lot of deciding about setting the docket, kind of what bills they're going to discuss the next day, how they're just going to discuss them, and kind of the parameters for discussing the bill. And so being a part of the Rules Committee actually gives you quite a lot of power in dictating what is going to be discussed in Congress. On top of that, he also had to lower the threshold to challenge his speakership to only one member needing to challenge his speakership rather than having the majority of the party challenge his speakership. However, just like a side note here, that doesn't necessarily mean that if Matt Gaetz all of a sudden wants to be like, I don't like you as speaker, I'm going to challenge you, that McCarthy's just going to be kicked out of Congress. Like, that's not how that's going to work. Still has to go through a vote, still has to go through a procedure, but lowering that threshold is still significant because it shows kind of how much power is lost, at least for McCarthy, and how his hands are basically like tied behind his back as he's trying to lead the 118th Congress. Another thing that he has done, it's like somewhat semi-related, semi-not related, is having a government accountability. So a new caucus will be created to investigate things that happened during the first 2 years of the Biden administration to see if there was anything fishy going on, see if anything was like constitutional or not. That was something that he had to concede to the Freedom Caucus. And then another thing that they're discussing, or at least McCarthy kind of wants to do as speaker, was just kind of thinking about term limits of 6 terms, not 6 years. My bad. So and then other things like border security and inflation are also on his mind, general regular things that we would expect from a Republican Speaker of the House. But also, with all of this in mind, what does that necessarily mean for the 118th Congress? As we said, debt ceiling talks are coming up. A lot of people are talking about whether or not there's going to be a shutdown because of the fact that lots of people can't agree. Democratic representatives, some of them are also not very happy with the setbacks on spending, because the spending is not only going towards defense, but it's going towards things like discretionary spending, healthcare spending, infrastructure spending. They're spending in their own districts even. And so negotiating the debt ceiling, if they cannot negotiate to like a set number or total that they want to be at, definitely possibility of a shutdown is high because of all of the disagreements. But also another thing is, because there is a very, very, very slim majority for the Republican Party in the House of Representatives, if they are not united on their goals, it will be hard for them to advance some of the things that they have on their agenda. Um, there are divides between those who are more far right, like the people on the Freedom Caucus, and those who are more moderate, like your Kevin McCarthy's. And in this sense, because there is kind of like infighting happening, there is this notion that maybe the Republican Party isn't going to get as much done as they want to, because they're not as united on certain issues as they might have once been before, or just not united on certain issues that they wanted to pass but can't pass because it's either considered too far right or considered too moderate to be something that they all will vote for. But yeah, a lot of things to keep in mind, very messy. I guess this does lead us to our question, which is, has the bruising battle over Speaker of the House done lasting damage to the Republican Party going into 2024? And that's kind of a change up. So usually reads the question, but I stole your thunder. Haha. It's okay. It's okay. I'll give it back to you. I'll let you answer.
Gosh darn it, YuYu. Like, how dare you steal my job? Like, that's always been my role on this podcast and things and podcast and yeah, you know.
Things and podcasts and things.
I mean, part of the reason why I was gonna be like, oh, I'm so ready for YuYu to go first is because YuYu's gonna give everybody the answer that you're gonna hear. It's almost like we've done this recording before. But when you have errors in the recording process, sometimes we both know. So, guess you're gonna end up with the crazy answer first. That's weird. So I mean, you're going to hear it from you. Probably the answer that most people would go with would be no, or probably would go with would be yes. Partly, and the reasoning that you will say is, this just looks bad. Like, I mean, let's be real. Hey, but here's the truth. Okay, and this is maybe the more political science theory-esque thing, the thing that I have a degree in. I think the answer here is no. Let's break this down a little bit. What does it mean to do lasting damage? It means that it's going to harm chances, probably, of re-election is kind of the way this question is wording it. So lasting damage is, how much is the Republican Party going to be harmed going into 2024, knowing that they can't make a decision? But here's the thing. And the argument I made in the previous recording that we did was, I personally think that the Republican Party really benefits from this, and partly because it helped them get into the news. And this is the way the U.S. political system works. It's a system based off of perverse incentives, which means that you have a benefit to the Republican Party, but it unfortunately harms the American public. And that's kind of the way that this all is going to unfold. The fact that it took so long for this to happen is truthfully going to be a benefit for the Republicans, because it showed, and probably even more for the most extreme Republicans, because people are more willing to accept into this game and accept and see the way that things are being done. The way that this all works here in the U.S. is, as a congressperson, your biggest goal is re-election. I mean, this is your job. If you are in Congress, You're getting paid to serve the American people. Hey, but in order to keep your job, you've got to get reelected. So, in theory, for any congressperson in either the House or the Senate, the biggest thing that's on your mind is reelection. We believe that they are single-minded seekers of reelection. That's kind of the way we phrase it. So anything that you can do to get yourself on the news helps you benefit your chances of reelection. And that's kind of the idea here. And that's why I think the answer truthfully is no. Hey, now, versus the last time we recorded, this topic just went away, which actually kind of helps to prove my point a little bit here. Which goes to show that, in truth, like, it's not gonna matter. Hey, Republicans are gonna do what they can to win. Hey, and if they can win re-election, hey, that's their goal. Hey, they want to retain their seat. That way they can keep making money, and it unfortunately harms the American public. How do you do that? You do things like what you do here. That way you get yourself on the news. Republicans, in the back of Republicans' minds, they're going to be like, this is great. This is something I really like to see, and I want this to keep happening. And unfortunately, it leads to more dysfunction. I mentioned 2011 with the debt ceiling earlier, and we note that is probably right when the first problems happened there. But let's take that a step further. What happened in 2011 was Republicans kind of delayed it by asking for other demands, which is really the first time that's happened. Normally it's just delayed, but in 2011 it was delayed with other demands, which is kind of the beginning of the whole debacle, right? And then what happened the next time we needed to raise the debt ceiling? It happened with the Democratic Party then. Hey, and it kind of went back and forth because the goal is to gain voters for re-election. So in theory, hey, kind of the way I see it is this doesn't just happen with Republicans, this also happens with Democrats. And you'll probably see in the future that Democrats won't be able to decide on a speaker either. Is that next time that they become the majority in the House? I don't know. But it's very likely that decisions are going to become a lot more difficult over time. But this is going to be a tactic ployed that will be used as an opportunity to gain more seats in Congress or to retain seats in Congress. As I will note, as always, theory is different from practice. But most people will take the logical answer of yes, because obviously this looks bad. But let's remember that the goal of any congressperson is to get reelected. So the faster you're on the news, and the more that you're on the news, means that more people give into your campaign for reelection. And unfortunately, that's kind of the way it works, and it allows for things like this to happen so you can gain more money and you can get reelected. So I think the answer here, honestly, is no, it doesn't do lasting damage. Rather, it does benefit the Republican Party. And yeah, that's the way I see it. YuYu, give the generic answer that we all know you're going to give here.
Wow, generic. I don't think it's generic. I think it's like logically backed up, and like the reason why a lot of people will say yes is because it seems like the most intuitive answer to this question. But we could talk about it. I think like if I were to say like no to this question, I would honestly just say that like look, the Republican Party is still going to do what they're going to do, and whether or not they make like progress on it might or might not matter. Like we're also hitting election cycles where it seems like there's going to be a red wave coming, and so does this necessarily reflect poorly on the Republican Party in terms of voting? Maybe not. Maybe we do actually end up with like a Republican president in, oh god, what year? 2024. Sorry, lost track of time. But you know, trajectories, political estimates, as far as they go, statistics, it seems like it's looking fine for the Republican Party. There's not much of like a dent. However, I will say that it has done damage to the Republican Party going into 2024 in the sense that it shows how like divided they are, right? And one of the biggest issues, like one of the biggest reasons why this was reported on in the first place was how shocking and surprising it was for people to see the Republican Party not unite for like anything not like anything, but for the biggest thing, which is Speaker of the House. Like you would think, because they want to be strong, because they want to show a sense that they are united and they have like things under control in their hands with the majority, that they would vote for like one individual person, have that person be the Speaker of the House and root for them to seem like a united party. But that didn't end up happening. And there are people on the Republican Party that actually scare away like majority of like American people because of how radical they are and how kind of like incoherent some of their policies are, not only in Congress, but also within the districts themselves, right? So taking this into note and understanding kind of like how bad it seems in terms of where is the Republican Party going to go and what are they going to do would like lead to the answer of yes. I think in this sense that like you're going to be seeing some turmoil the next 2 years, at least among the Republican Party in deciding what they want to do. There is going to be lots of disagreement. There are probably going to be like private conversations held behind doors and not on the floor. But either way, like those negotiations could come through. Those negotiations could also fall through and not have a lot of impact on their voters and on the people that are living in their district. So if there's not much of an impact there, then there's not really a lot that the Republican Party can say that they have done in like the next 2 years before elections, right? But on top of that, I also think like while media plays a big role in influencing who people see that they can support and who people will vote for, I do also think another important part of like elections and who's going to be elected is whether or not you're focusing and prioritizing the people within your district that are voting for you, right? So if you don't put their priorities as your priorities, then they don't see you as doing something for them, right? They feel ignored, they don't have like the support that they want to from the representative, which actually ends up being the reason why a lot of people tend to vote for someone else or tend to vote for like a Democratic representative or even a Republican representative, is because they didn't feel heard. And whether or not they personally align with Democrat or Republican policies doesn't necessarily matter in that process, or it doesn't necessarily matter in that thought process, because what mattered to them was like, what have they done for me? And kind of like my time in Congress, I feel like pays ode to this. I feel like I've had a lot of conversations with people talking about campaigns, mainly like how do elections go, where do they go, what happens, has been a lot about like what the representative can do for their people. And if people are unhappy with you, then they're going to vote you out. Is that going to happen to Matt Gaetz? Probably not. He's in like a part of Florida that very much like aligns with him. Is that going to happen to Marjorie Taylor Greene? Probably not either. But is it going to make a difference in terms of deciding like what's going to happen in the 2024 elections? Maybe, because you have people who will sway one way and you have other people who will sway the other way. I also think another thing to like think about is whether or not this type of media will reflect like positively, in the sense that it's like, oh, it's fine, like they're just fighting right now, they'll get over it later, right? Or whether or not people will internalize that and think to themselves, well, this looks like a mess and this isn't like what I signed up for, like I wanted something else. Then that's also something to take into consideration. And I feel like what happened and what has been reported on the news about the Speaker of the House votes like reflects the sentiments of people sometimes, in that they're like, what is going on? Like this isn't what I wanted. Like this is not the party that I want leading my country if they can't even decide on simple issues like this. And in that sense, I think it does call into question a lot of things that most or some people have about like the Republican Party and like what they're going to get done in the future. On that note though, like 2024 Republicans are going to meet in July to see who is going to be in their primaries. Probably end up being DeSantis of Florida, I think. And then a couple of others. Trump is probably going to be in that mix as well. Whether or not that ends up being Trump as the primary will also dictate a lot of things, especially like outcomes in 2024, I think as well. So lots of things to consider when like thinking about Republican Party, Democratic Party, their strengths, etc. And it's not just like this specific moment that will define like the Republican Party for the rest of history, right? But in context, because it does give people questions about what's going to happen, it is a big moment, and I think it has like a lasting impact on the Republican Party.
See, one of the reasons why I really like this question is because there is a really good debate on it. And I think a lot of people would agree with YuYu here. Okay, and that's kind of why I mentioned like it's really cool to see YuYu go first, but then we got me going first, right? But that's besides the point, right? YuYu's answer is probably what most people think. Hey, and I think a lot of people more so are going to align with that. But it's not necessarily the way the US system works, and that's kind of the point behind the yes argument. Hey, think of it like this, or this is the way that I explained it last time. If you go back to our episode on political polarization, which was, I don't remember what episode number that was, go find it. But if you go back to the episode on political polarization, the first thing that one of the things I discussed about is the United States is not polarized, and it's a common misconception. The people who vote are the most extreme in the U.S. Okay? So voters are voting in extreme Democrats and extreme Republicans because that's kind of the split. And it's gotten worse over time. Like over since 1984, it's become more extreme based off of the voters. So polarization in the US is because the people that are voting in the US are polarized. And that's only like a small chunk of US citizens, unfortunately. So what does the point here is, what does this show about Republicans? Does this do lasting damage? Well, in a sense, people who voted for the extreme Republicans, or the people that, in this instance, held up McCarthy for trying not to be Speaker of the House, right? The people that prevented him from being Speaker of the House. Hey, for these voters, this is great. This is exactly what they want. So they're going to keep voting them in, just like what you had mentioned. Hey, because these voters are the most extreme, the most polarizing, and the most influential in these districts. But this is also going to have a say on current, like, what you might deem as moderate Republicans, which really aren't moderate anymore. I would argue, there's almost no sense of moderacy in the U.S. anymore, based off of who is elected and who isn't. These moderate Republicans are at risk, and they're probably more at risk in primaries. And you may see more of the far right swing, which is kind of the point that I'm going for. This benefits the far right, and that allows them to get more people elected into Congress. Now, that's really bad for Democrats, because that means that Democrats could possibly lose to bigger red waves, right? That may possibly happen. In 2024 may be a Republican win. It all kind of depends. There's a few different things that we can see here. But at the end of the day, if the people that vote are the most polarizing, the most extreme in the U.S., then things like this look really good for Republicans, especially if you are more focused on maybe on the more extreme side, maybe the more polarizing side. This is exactly what you want to see, and there's a possibility that more extreme Republicans can turn out. First thing that comes into my head is the election that Lauren Boebert won, right? Very narrowly. If that can happen, there's a possibility that can happen across the U.S. And it's kind of an unfortunate truth, and the way of me just thinking about it, but like narrow competitive districts like that in Colorado could very much appear across the board in the U.S. And you could see more extreme right-wing Republicans winning and benefiting off of this system. So that's kind of the point behind the yes answer. It's more theoretical, um, obviously, because what else do I talk about? But the thing that's really worth noting here is if this answer is very complicated, if you're an extemper or a speech and debater, if this answer is complicated, go with no. Okay, because no is very common sense. A lot of your judges are going to understand that a lot better. But the point behind understanding the yes is the political system is designed for this to pay off for Congress people. So, unfortunately, what you see here in the House of Representatives and the battle for Kevin McCarthy's speakership, it's very evident that McCarthy ends up regaining, or not regaining Speaker of the House. He might not be Speaker of the House next time, but it could be a more extreme Republican Party in the House of Representatives, and this could be one of the highlighted points that Republicans may put. That they may say, we're trying to figure out how to work together, but also promote Republican policies. And they may push Republican a lot more because there's a fear of Democrats from Republicans. It's also the same thing from the Democratic side. There's a fear of Republicans from Democrats. So the point here is this is designed to help people in Congress and specifically the Republican Party. And that's the way that this all kind of functions in the US. Remember, theory is different from practice. If it's very complicated, like I said, no is a very simple answer. If you're giving a speech for a judge, you want to go with the answer that's going to best, that your judge is going to understand the most. Hey, just common sense there about extemp. Hey, but for general talking purposes, the way that the US works and the way its governmental system works in advanced theory basically shows that this is really good for really good for the Congress people and for the Republican Party.
I think you meant to switch around your answers there. Like if you probably should answer yes if it's complicated, because then you would say it has done damage.
Yeah,
Um
yeah, I whatever. Same
yeah,
difference.
just clarification there. I think like again, I'll reiterate your point. Like theory is much different than practice, and there's definitely a lot out there that disproves that theory, I think, in my opinion, because again, like we know in general that people are very much complicated and our political systems are complicated as well. Sometimes when we predict one thing happening, it actually doesn't happen. I would also say that like yes, there has been like a favorite towards extremist views more recently, but I don't think like that has been in favor of certain policies. And I also don't think that's also like necessarily true, because there has been like this turn away from Donald Trump because he was too extreme. The support for the insurrection is also a bit extreme for most American people. So I feel like there are general sentiments towards far right policies that seem actually very scary to other people. And like definitely for sure, like far left policies also seem scary to other people. But I think there has been like more coverage and more news of how far right ideology can be very scary, which turns off a lot of people and probably like disincentivizes them from wanting President or former President Trump to run again 2024. Another thing is, I think like even if this were the truth that people want more extremist views, I don't think finally allowing McCarthy to become Speaker of the House would necessarily say this is a win to them. I feel like if they're going to be extreme, they might as well be like really extreme and like definitely not want McCarthy as Speaker of the House and would want someone more extreme to be Speaker of the House. And so while there were concessions that were made, these concessions still don't necessarily like influence the way that Congress is technically going to operate, and also influence like the ways that maybe they will like sway more towards far right policies. I do think like just because McCarthy is elected and just because the Freedom Caucus was able to get concessions from him, that doesn't necessarily mean that those people who are more extreme and more far right would support that, because they didn't get like a far right Speaker of the House. They got a more moderate one. Um, Other than that, though, I think like there are just different factors that we have to consider when we think about like how exactly does the American political system work, right? Such a complex issue that we've spent literally like hundreds of years trying to figure out what it's going to be like and how it's going to operate. And sometimes those predictions are false. Sometimes our predictions are false. But we both encourage you to do your own research from your own opinions that is well warranted, and not baseless. So definitely fact check us. I guess like more so on my side because I don't have a degree, but definitely fact check the both of us regardless. And yeah, I don't think I have any more else to add. I like covered everything we covered in the last recording.
I I do too. At the end of the day, right? Like this is a good topic, and this is a fantastic question that we should be asking. Like I think most people would look at this and go yes, right? It does do lasting damage. Some of us might look at it and go no, it doesn't, right? But once again, this did disappear from the news, right? And it's kind of a huge part of the question as well. So there's other things that we haven't talked about, right? But at the end of the day, the purpose of this is to form your own opinions and to discuss this, right? Sometimes we give questions that have general just yeses. We can't really we can't give a no, right? But this question here is perfect. It gives you both a yes and a no. So up to you. Make your decision here. Let us know. What do you think? Let us know. We want you to know. Type it out.
The criticism.
The criticism. Okay. Everybody's going to be like, it's more of a maybe.
Honestly, you're probably right. Like, I could see an extemper doing that. Be like, actually, it's a maybe.
If you give a maybe, yeah. Okay, extemp advice, real fast. If you give a maybe, you didn't answer the question. Give a yes or no, please. That's just typical extemp advice. Like, I hate to be the person that says it, but I'm the judge that will dock you if you do that.
I will not dock you if you do that. So
give me a straight answer.
Anyway, okay. A second extemp advice is we also know that this disappeared from the news, or it hasn't been as reported on, but for sure read up on it on your own time and kind of Google search it on your own, because even if it has disappeared from mass media and general media, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not important anymore. You should definitely keep an eye on what's going on in your political party. I guess that's not the right word. I guess you should be aware of what is going on politically in the country that you're living in, because it does affect you on a day-to-day basis.
And it's not only important to learn about what's going on in your country, but also in countries around you, because a lot of things do affect the U.S. in one way or another, right? It just keep up with the news, right? My recommendation, because the problem I mentioned of people are becoming more extreme, voters are becoming more extreme, right? It is true. It's factually backed up. If you read, if anybody here who watches, general audience, whatever, if you read about 15, I argue that you read about 15 minutes of news a day, right? Typically from pretty centrist sources. You can go center left, center right. Either works. But if you read from typically relatively centrist sources about 15-20 minutes a day, you'll generally develop a pretty informed decision about where you stand and what you believe are what your political opinions are. I understand that some people watch left politics and right politics, but at the end of the day, do your own research. It's typically best to stick to those, to kind of a more centrist, center right, center left area. And if you do that, you'll be able to develop an opinion about what you think based off of certain issues.
Yeah, I mean, even if you read far left, far right, just be aware of the assumptions that they're making in the articles, and I think
absolutely
you'll take something out of it, but at least you know where they're coming from.
I totally agree, right? If you're going through, if you're somebody that's a hard Republican and you're reading Fox News, right, and you agree with everything that you read, you're probably not reading the right source, right? And it's the same thing if you're somebody that's a hard Democrat and you watch MSNBC or you watch CNN, right, and you agree with everything that they're saying, you're probably not watching the right source. So kind of the idea here is you got to be able to develop that information from a source that doesn't give it to you in a biased manner, right? And that's kind of tough to do. And I think, like, especially with the way the U.S. media works nowadays, and across different countries too, this is kind of the case, right? You might have like state-sponsored media. Just remember that too. A really good way to judge U.S. politics is to read from an international source, right? The BBC, for example, gives a fantastic view of U.S. politics in a way that you've probably never read with any other source. It's pretty centrist on U.S. politics because they report U.S. politics to British people, right? And it's the same way. So go out and read like international news because sometimes, or international news on U.S. news, and you'll see something totally different that you don't normally see, right? Like read Al Jazeera, read BBC, etc. So kind of there's a couple of different ways you can look at the U.S. from not just looking at it from U.S. news, right? And that's a good way to also judge your opinion on U.S. politics.
Listen to our podcast.
Our podcast is really good too. It has some credibility.
A little bit. Yeah, just honestly, like, listen to the news, understand some of the assumptions that they're making, or maybe some of the analysis that they don't necessarily make. Think critically about it, I would say, and keep doing Extemp. Extemp is like such a great way to keep up with the news. So tell us how you did. I hope you get the one in the round. If you didn't, it's fine. Let us know anyway. We're always curious. Be sure to follow us on social media on Instagram and Twitter at the Half Hour Extemp Podcast. We post occasionally. We're also MIA on that, but it's okay. We're getting back to it. Other than that, also follow us on YouTube. Our episodes come out earlier there than on One Clap. So hit the subscribe button, ring the bell so that you don't miss when our episodes come out. Kind of cool. Sometimes they're a little chaotic. That's okay too. Yeah, we love you all. Thank you for the support. Thank you for bearing with us in these months that we've been MIA. Hopefully we can get our schedules figured out, and hopefully Spencer will be employed. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you all so much for watching. Next week, kind of a spoiler because we're almost there for it. Next week is kind of almost as similar to this, so you'll be able to see kind of like some sort of comparison. We have an international topic. We're about to record it, not today, but tomorrow for us. So it's got some similar lines, which is particularly fascinating to see kind of like what's happening in the U.S. is also sort of happening across the world. So I'm actually pretty excited for that. I've been reading into it a little bit. So you'll see it. We'll talk a little bit about it next week. So thank you all so much for watching. And until next time, I will see you all later.